I'm joined by some celebrity guests from Lichfield Diocese today to talk about our celebrations of 25 years of women's ordination to the priesthood. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I know some of you a little bit, but not very much about any of you. So if you would say who you are, what your role is in the diocese, and when you're ordained.
Right, I'm Maureen Hobbs. I was ordained 21 years ago now. And now I am a parish priest and half-time diocesan officer in the ministry division.
What does that mean?
Well, that means that I help other clergy throughout the diocese with their continuing ministerial development.
Okay, 21 years experience. You've probably learned a thing or two.
Well, I hope so. Yes, that's the idea. Anyway.
Excellent.
Yes.
Sarah?
I was ordained deacon in 1997 and priest in 1998, so I didn't have to wait. I am currently lead chaplain at the University of Wolverhampton. I was a parish priest for 21 years before that, and I have the honorary role of Bishop's Advisor for Women in Ministry, which means I sit on senior staff to represent all the female clergy in the diocese.
Okay, so you've got a pretty good idea of how many women there are ordained now as to how many there used to be, or...?
It's quite a rapidly moving and quite a varied pattern. But yeah, I know some of the statistics, but the roles vary. But
yeah, okay. What are you doing at the table, John?
That's a very good question. I feel a bit like an interloper in some ways, but in fact I've been part of Lichfield Diocese since I was ordained in this cathedral in 1991, having come from the States, where I served as a Lutheran minister. So I've served in various roles, but the last 18 years I've actually been serving 3 rural-based churches just north of here, Orwas, Fradley and Witchner. I'm also a prebendary serving the cathedral.
Right. And so you have been part of this diocese throughout the change, where women have been ordained into the priesthood, and you have worked alongside the likes of Pippa. Pippa, is that right? Who's been here for a while. Tell us, Pippa, when were you ordained?
I've always lived in the diocese, and I was ordained as a deacon in 1988. The first women deacons were 1987, but I actually went to college expecting to come out as a deaconess, which has no dog collar and actually is not the female counterpart of deacon.
I've never understood the difference. I didn't know they didn't have a dog collar.
No, and they're not reverend or anything like that.
Really?
So I went because I was a reader in Schofield Church, and the vicar left, and I ended up doing the vicar's job. So somebody
by
said...
default.
As you do.
Well, I had to take all the funerals and things.
Right, of course.
And so somebody said, well, you better go and do it properly. But I was only going to come out as a deacon, which wasn't... didn't actually do much, didn't change much from a reader.
Right.
But by the General Synod had passed the measure whereby we could be ordained deacon, but not priest.
Not priest. How many years was there between that?
7.
7 years where you were allowed to be a deacon but not a priest.
Yes.
So you were a deacon that whole time?
No, 6 of those
6
years.
of those, okay.
And it was... I became the Bishop's Advisor for Women in Ministry during that time, so I got quite political then.
Did you?
Oh, yeah.
Did you rally? Did you campaign?
Well, yes.
Somebody must have been.
We used to go to London, and so it was very exciting when we actually heard I was there at the vote, but not in the chamber.
Yeah.
I was in the Methodist Hall. And those of you who knew Beryl, she was a very large deaconess and rather scary. And my husband happened to be sitting next to her, and the vote went through, and we had to wait because there was a quick calculation. It was so close.
Really?
And it was 1 or 2. And this enormous, fierce woman embraced my husband.
Oh, I'm sure he loved it.
Still recovering.
Still smiling.
Yes.
Still smiling.
I cracked the plaster on the roof of somebody's apartment because I had been listening to her on the radio, and my friend had a television, I didn't have a television, and it was before mobiles and everything. She rang me up on the landline saying, you've got to come over. So I went over the road, and she was living in really awful student accommodation that was quite damp. And she was in an attic, so we were watching this. And there was a pause, wasn't there?
Yes,
And
yes.
somebody kind of squeaked because the result was received in silence because it was contentious.
Oh, yeah, you're not
And
allowed
we
to
were
clap.
told-
We're still not allowed to clap
We were
now.
trying to work out the result, and I just went, yeah, and jumped and fell on the floor. And then the next day, Dorothy, the old lady who lived below, comes up and says, well, what was going on? Were you having a party? Because the plaster all around my light fitting all fell down.
You were so excited you fell on the floor and broke the ceiling below.
Indeed.
I was a church warden at the time. Didn't have any clue at that point that it would impact on me personally. But because I was interested, I'd arranged to work from home that day so that I could work and keep one eye on the TV, you see. And then I can remember having a real visceral reaction when the vote came through, an enormous kind of leap in the pit of my stomach, and I sort of remember thinking, what was all that about?
Little did you
Little did I know. That was the start of a long journey.
Wow. Where were you, John?
Well, I was actually on post-ordination, or what used to be called potty training.
Potty
At that
training.
point, yes, indeed. In my second year, I guess I would have been priest at just about that time. And having come from the United States and from the Lutheran Church where women were being ordained for ministry since 1970, for me, it felt very strange to be coming into the Church of England as a fairly new ordinand, but it was all just men still at that point in time. And when we got the information that the vote had actually successfully gone through all of the houses of General Synod, which I don't think was expected by many people at all, I personally was like you, Sarah. I nearly hit the ceiling in terms of joy. But there were colleagues of mine who really struggled, whether they were on the Anglo-Catholic side or indeed perhaps the evangelical side. And it was a very, very painful time for them. And my own joy had to be very circumspect because of the fact that they really were distressed. And I was puzzled as well.
Well, that's still the continuing reality, isn't it? Were
But
you with colleagues?
much more muted now. I mean, I don't run across it at all, really. But I don't know if you... No, you weren't there. But we had set up a celebration, or I can't remember what it was called, in Stafford, in the main church in Stafford. The Forward in Faith people and those who were angling for women in the church
The
as
Mo
priests.
women. It was the
That's
Mo
right.
movement
To
for
the
the
ordination
ordination of
of
women.
And of course they thought the other side thought they would win, and it was so we'd done a service that would work either way.
Oh, wow.
But they were it was just awful.
Imagine.
So because they were so upset and could never, some of them said, well, that's it, I can't be part of the Church of England now.
The parish priest that I knew the best left that night. So the most influential church on me was my grandmother's church, because that was the constant church. My parents moved a bit, and that church was the church I'd known since childhood, and he had always been very positive. I felt called to ordination since I was 14, 15, which was the mid-80s. And so he knew that. My gran was opposed to the ordination of women, and they had two people on placement, both training. And they went to the deaconings, and they were both deaconed. And then the following year, she went to the priestings and suddenly realised that the woman was sitting in the congregation while her husband was being ordained. And that was a lightning moment for my gran. She changed her mind. But on the night of the vote, the parish priest, he prayed through the night. He sat in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and the next morning he got up. And I was really privileged. I went to his ordination as a Roman Catholic priest. So he sort of got up, he contacted her, and I was in Birmingham Cathedral for his ordination as a Roman Catholic priest. And he stayed in touch 4 years. He still served as a Roman Catholic priest, but he left the next day. So it wasn't a bigger change. Obviously, there were colleagues who were married, who had children, who perhaps didn't have that route. So he just simply changed religious orders and joined the Roman Catholic
Do
Church.
we know how many people actually did leave? How many male colleagues did leave the church?
I don't know the numbers.
I
no.
can't remember. I've got a feeling of a number of something like 400 something
Nationally.
nationally.
It wasn't as many as
It wasn't as many as
expected.
they all expected.
And some came back.
Then
Quite a few came
about
back.
half of them
Really?
came back.
Did they?
They did, but interestingly, very few of those paid back their financial
Exactly.
compensation that they
Yes.
received.
There
when
was
they left.
financial compensation.
Yes.
I don't know about any of this.
Roughly a year's stipend thereabouts,
Yeah.
So
wasn't
you
it?
could leave on.
And be paid for doing it.
And be paid for doing
Wow.
Well, it was generosity,
it. It was generosity.
Of course.
but it should have been kind of repaid in the sense
Yes.
to come back. So it seems to me.
Yes. Yes.
Gosh, I didn't know about any of that.
Yeah.
Really, none of it.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in which thing, because I went on those vigils and protests as a child. So now I'm wondering if you were, I was in York and I was in Coventry. And I think I went to one in London as well. Because I remember Movement for the Ordination of Women that I called MAO. I didn't realise it was called MAO, but most
MAO,
people, most,
MAO.
yeah.
MAO,
But,
yeah.
St Martin's in the Fields had
Yes.
quite a radical
Yes.
bookshop in
Yes.
those days, and they
Yes. They were the
sold these.
centre of it.
God is an equal opportunities
Yes.
employer.
Yes.
If women can't be priests, stop baptising. And
Oh wow.
the hand that rocks the cradle should also rock the boat was another
Oh,
one.
it's a
there.
brilliant one, isn't it?
I like
And then
that.
the classic
Gotta get a
one,
t-shirt
a
with that
woman's
on.
place is
Is
in
in
the
the
house.
house.
House of Bishops.
Yes.
But I used to go to these things as a child, as a teenager.
Wow.
It was,
So you've always been clear that this was your path.
I think, I think so. But that's a very strange thing for careers officers because you sort of turn up and say, in the mid '80s, this is what I want to do, and the poor careers officer, I didn't go to a Christian school. Oh yes, we'll look this up, and then they get to a filing cabinet,
No.
and it's like, no. So what else
The
do you
wrong
want to do?
gender.
And I just said, there's nothing else. This is all I want to do.
Wow.
And they didn't really know what to do with me. So it's interesting.
And as you said earlier, there were some people, you said, I think, who'd been waiting and waiting and waiting.
Yes.
Yeah. And that
Yes.
obviously wasn't the case for you. You were busy getting on with doing something and then found yourself doing something else and then
That's right.
was there ready to
Yes.
go.
Yeah.
Was that the case for you? That when did you feel called? Obviously you were a church warden
I
when
was
it
a
all
church
happened, so you
warden.
weren't waiting and
That's
waiting
right.
either.
And then I can't remember the timing now, but a little while later, I expressed some interest in a course that my diocese, which was the Diocese of Oxford, were bringing in sort of theology for lay people. And I said to my then vicar, I said, I'm quite interested in that. And he said, if you're interested in that, and you said something like this, Pippa, he said, why don't you do it properly? And I said, what do you mean, do it properly? He said, go the whole hog, get ordained. And I said, don't be so stupid. I can't possibly do that. And he said, why not? I said, well, for a start, I'm divorced. How can, And he said, doesn't matter. So as long as you don't get remarried before you're ordained, that's okay. And I said, well, no. Anyway, and then he said, well, come and see me. And he spent about 2 hours in his study gradually demolishing all my arguments as to why I couldn't possibly be a priest.
Yeah.
And at the end of that, I was sort of forced to admit there was no reason why I couldn't be. It was then a question of, well, did God want me
Whether
to
God
be?
was calling you to be.
So then I sort of went away and thought about it. But it was one of those things that the more it stayed with me, the more impossible to ignore it became.
Well, that seems to be a feature of callings, doesn't it?
Yes.
For lots of people.
And
My
then-
own story, I didn't want to.
Yeah.
I definitely had no intention. I come from a very traditional, conservative sort of family, and I had no role models of women in leadership at all. I definitely did not think that would be my role. I was at vicar school with my husband. He was going to be the vicar, not me. I didn't want. I was going to be quite happy being the vicar's wife. I was going to be a midwife. And God, I had very strong sense of calling, and had all those same conversations about how why it was absolutely ridiculous and totally unnecessary, and. But when that call is so vivid, I mean, I admire your clarity on it,
Yes.
I have to say. And
Okay,
you
isn't
didn't
it-
try and give it a swerve either, did you?
Oh, no.
Because loads of us tried to give it a swerve, men and women, I
natural.
think.
So it never occurred to me because it just wasn't a possibility.
Yeah.
I never questioned it. It just wasn't.
Well, there's something about seeing people for the first time.
Yes.
So I remember vividly seeing somebody at the front of church that was female for the first time, and it was a young woman, and she was preaching. She wasn't ordained, but I just remember thinking, how is she doing that? that is just so exposed. All these people, they're all going to have an opinion on her. And I mean, it must have been, to be among those first women, that sense must have been so much stronger.
I do remember going into church, and I said, okay, because my call was a nag, just nag, wouldn't go away. Oh, shut up, yeah.
Be in the ear.
Yes, and I eventually went into church and I pointed at the pulpit and I said, okay, God, I'll do it, but I'm never going up there.
Right. So say you.
Famous
He
last words.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point, though, for people who are watching, in that one of the other things I do is I'm a researcher into the experience of young women feeling called to ordained ministry. And there is a lot of research around visible role models. However, there's quite a lot of research that challenges the idea that you need to see women in leadership. And it talks about male encouragers. And
yes.
so
That's where you come in.
that's why you're here, John. But it is really interesting. And
It
if I
matters.
think back to the people that were inspirational on my journey, because there was no one to see, and I remember the first time I saw a woman celebrate communion, because I started college in '95, so there weren't many around, was at college.
Actually, yes.
And years later, having a conversation with two women that I was at college with, and this was decades later, literally last year, discovering that for the three of us, that had been the first time. But we just assumed that it wasn't for everyone else. But in my journey, Canon John Atherton, who was a theologian at Manchester Cathedral, my history teacher, Mr. Leary, who's probably dead by now, who when he wasn't even a Christian, he found out I wanted to be ordained and was taking a first-year secondary school class at Southall Minster and just said, look, I've got this girl in sixth form. What am I going to do with her? And he found me the director of ordinance for the Diocese of Southall, who had this 16-year-old turn up on the bus.
But doesn't it show, though, the impact? Because I think I love collecting vocation stories, calling stories, because there's quite a lot of common themes, and it's quite often an individual or two or
Several
three individuals
yes.
just taking the time to hear your story, to see, I see you and God sees you. And actually, that for me, that was men as well. It was more men than women. But I think there's a sense of permission giving in that. Or for me, I needed I needed the approval of men to hear it as well, because you'd sort of expect women in that position to say, come on in, the water's lovely. Because of course it is, isn't it? Have you experienced much to the contrary, ladies?
I do want to tell you a story about an interview I went to, which was that it was in the days of old-fashioned interviews where you went and talked to people. And so the church wardens, two male church wardens, took me round the parish, round the church, and then we had a very formal three-course lunch at, and John was with me, my husband, who's a solicitor. And so we were both doing the chat, and he's good at chat. And so we got to the pudding, and the church warden's wife leaned over to him and said, Mr. Thorneycroft, what are you going to do about the church linen?
Oh, I like
I didn't get that job.
What was his response again?
Oh, that's lovely.
It does raise the question, though, clergy husbands, because I mean, you're
I've got one.
but as in, not husbands who are clergy, but lay. Because I don't know about you, people don't know what to do with them. My husband eventually worked out it was guttering because he was quite good with heights, and my training incumbent was quite short. But
There are different expectations quite
that
often,
was a
I
new
think.
thing, a very new thing. I was very surprised last year, really taken aback in this cathedral to have someone refuse to receive communion from me.
Really?
And I was surprised, but I was also quite happy because I thought, actually, I never remember that expo. I've been in Lichfield Wolverhampton for 12 years. Nobody has refused communion from me in the last 12 years that I can think of.
Have they not?
No. In Manchester, it used to happen a lot.
Would they dare?
So it was it was saddening, but it was also, actually, we have come a long way because it's been a long time since it, and it used to happen a lot. And
That's true.
the other thing, quickly, is the thing around the theology of taint. And I think for me, one of the saddest things I saw was a male colleague attending an ordination and laying hands on some women who were being ordained, which is the tradition, you know, laying hands, and watching traditional colleagues melt away from him because he wasn't all right anymore. And so it does have impacts as well.
Yes, it does.
And I think those stories have a psychological impact on those who are less confident in coming forward, or those, because people see that stuff, don't they?
I had a wonderfully supportive training incumbent, but I was the first woman to work in the church, which was a big civic church in the centre of Shrewsbury, when I was ordained. And before I arrived, one of the many retired clergy who were associated with the place preached an invective sermon against the evils of ordained women. I mean, thankfully he did it before I arrived, because he said he didn't want to make it personal against me. It would,
Kind of is though, isn't it? It always feels personal. I don't know how it feels for you, but it does.
And my training incumbent warned me, because the local paper picked up on it, and you know, this was as I was moving in, and you know.
Welcome to the parish.
Welcome to the parish. You know. Welcome to the
But
parish.
that issue of working with colleagues, I mean,
that
now
makes such a difference.
There are still.
Yeah.
I mean, do we know roughly what the numbers are in our diocese of parishes which will not receive the ministry of women?
Quite small. There are some.
There are some.
It's a really small number,
Resolution
but they
parishes.
are focused in certain areas.
Yes.
So Stoke, Wolverhampton,
West Brom.
West Brom.
West Brom, and there are churches for whom they're on a journey. So in 1993, the Act of Synod was passed, which enabled people to pass resolutions A and B, and something called C, which isn't actually a resolution, but you have to be a geek to know that.
Let's assume our viewers aren't. And we'll just stick to A and B.
And then we introduced women into the episcopacy, women as bishops, and the whole process was changed, and people needed to reconsider. And so there are still churches who are considering whether they want to come under a different bishop. So Bishop Michael will delegate his powers to a number of bishops, and they're on that journey.
And being part of that journey, as a curate, I was licensed to a group of parishes, one of whom had never received or they'd only recently stopped having resolutions A and B, and they've recently just had license to their first female priest. Excellent. And it's going extremely well. And actually, ministers within that congregation who received for the first time from me are receiving have actively changed their position now, but that's through a gradual, gentle process of exclusion.
And that's generally what happens. I mean, you're never going to convince somebody by browbeating them, but by gentle persuasion, you can.
Is that how it was? Because you were part of the 10 years at General Synod campaigning for women to be bishops, weren't you?
And my experience is that, I mean, I made a point when I was first ordained of going to see all the people who were against women's ordination, to say, well, okay, you can't accept my orders as such, but you can still accept me as an individual, and I'm interested in you, and you know, we had pastoral conversations.
It becomes much harder when it's dealing with an individual.
Yes, and I mean, I can remember one lovely little lady who at the time was 93, so I'm fairly sure she's no longer with us. She's really breaking some limits. Who came up to about my waist. You know, she was tiny, and she looked up at me and she said, "Well, my dear, you know I'm not really in favour of women. You know, women in the priesthood." And I said, "Yes, I do know, Kate. But, you know, I'm here for you even so." And she said, "But you're different."
Yeah. How many of us have
How many
heard
have
that?
heard that?
Yeah.
Which made me laugh, because I thought, right, does that mean I'm not a woman? Or
Not a real priest, or she might be changing her mind.
Oh, she might be changing her mind,
Yeah.
yes.
But I have a question for Pippa, which is possibly a contrast between, because I remember the big ordinations in 94, which were incredibly powerful. They were all women. Last year I was at a priesting which by complete fluke was all women. And I was reminded that we had 94 with this amazing, is it 1600? And then by the time I was deaconed in 97, I was the only woman in the procession, because Manchester didn't even have women in the choir then, they didn't have female servers.
Really?
Goodness.
And we had a few years where, there were 2 women deacons in my year, one in June and me in September, Peter Tide and Michaelmas. And there were 12 of us all together, and it was seen that we would be an interesting impact on the men, so we were separated. We weren't allowed to be in the same group. We had to be a token woman in each group.
Crikey.
And I used to judge it by the length of queues at diocesan conferences. But was there something...
For the loos?
Yeah. And now we get bishops in the loos, which is very weird.
They have to have their own.
But I just wonder, what was it like to be... Was there something magical about that number of women, or was it just you were so glad that it all come to an end?
So there were 51 in this diocese.
Yeah.
So we had 25 one day and 26 the next.
And by this time, John, you were wondering what all the fuss was about and trying to travel alongside your male colleagues who were struggling with it. How's that been? And do you still find that you have to be politic and that you have to...
No, I think the politic thing probably, at least where I happen to serve over in Lichfield Deanery, it's not been a particular issue there, for which I've been very grateful. So in my travels around the diocese, there have been some sections where I suppose there still is some people who feel, you know, it's not something that they can affirm or accept theologically. But I think one of the things that's made me very pleased, having served for many years, more years now as an Anglican priest than a Lutheran pastor, is the number of people who have actually just warmly embraced, you know, men and women serving together collaboratively in ordained expressions of leadership. And I think that's brilliant. And that cheers me. And I've had the privilege of having a number of superb female colleagues and continue to. And to me, that makes me happy.
It's much better, much healthier, where there's an equal partnership.
But we have a ways to go, don't we, for that? I mean, Sarah, you were saying it, I don't know if you know real figures, but it's getting closer to the 50%, isn't it?
It's getting closer, but the thing that is still very distant is in the kind of roles. So women are disproportionately in unpaid roles, in junior roles, in part-time roles. And
Is it they also in more rural areas? Because I just in both areas where I've ministered now, well, in our area, we are completely women, and there's a real rumble in the area, and I almost it can feel a bit uncomfortable. And I said, well, you know, it kind of was only men for generations, but I think it's more to do with the types of ministry, is it? Or
we haven't done the data analysis exactly. However, there certainly is an issue around getting women in urban priority areas. That remains an issue, in that women tend not to go towards urban priority areas.
And
there are
getting
some
women
notable
into the
exceptions.
larger churches.
That's a massive thing as
yeah,
well.
I guess the big, sexy jobs, those city jobs, whereas perhaps rural towns are less like that, maybe.
Likely.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that is where women go is chaplaincy. A lot of women go into chaplaincy, and I think that's sometimes to do with more flexible working time.
Perhaps, yes.
And a lot of women, particularly in our diocese, we see a lot of women as ministry officers working in the diocesan offices. And it's interesting, women in dioceses statistically tend to, certainly in this diocese, go towards ministry development, and men tend to go towards evangelism. So if you look at in this diocese, if you look at the evangelism team, it's predominantly male, and if you look at the ministry team, it's predominantly female. And how much of that is the expectations of people who appoint? How much of that is what women apply for? How much of that is natural? How much of that is societal? I find fascinating. But that's where we are. But we do need to look towards an equal number of men and women in senior roles, and we also need to look at supporting men who want to become part-time. Supporting men who want non-stipendiary roles as well. Because I think there is this thing of automatically channeling men into 6-day-a-week roles who might not want that. So.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
The big milestones have happened, and you guys have just been getting on with the business of getting on, and I am extremely grateful as someone. I was even grateful into my post not being the first female vicar they've ever had, because I acknowledge how scary that would even be still for me, but I'm grateful that isn't the case for me. But I'm so grateful for you guys who were willing to do the campaigning, to be in those general synod debates, to have that clarity of vocation from the start. That fortitude to stick with something that an institution that did not want you at this stage. That is unbelievable, really, to be part
is.
of. So does the 25-year thing feel like another of those milestones for you, or is it just we've just been getting on with it? What does the 25-year anniversary mean to you?
It's astonishing that it's so long and so short at the same time.
Not as long as the Lutheran Church, anyway.
No, that's right.
John, what does the 25-year anniversary mean to you?
I think one of the most positive things and joyful things I've experienced, there are some people who were ardently, they said, theologically against the ordination of women to priestly ministry. And now that's not an issue at all for them. They have just been completely won over by the integrity of the women who have served. And it's wonderful that somehow it didn't seem to actually be a theological issue at all. When it got right down to it, maybe it was much more about really rediscovering trust, respect, and flourishing relationship. So I'm thrilled by that, but I look forward to the day when we're actually trying to liberate all the laity of our church, and we don't have to have Diocesan Advisers, women's ministry on bishops' staff, because it is just so natural, so integrated. To me, that's the next milestone, perhaps,
right,
along with others.
What about you, Sarah?
I have quite mixed feelings about it. Gender was of nothing compared to being epileptic. And I went joyfully through my selection conference in 1995 to then get the message back, oh, by the way, we didn't realise you had epilepsy, we don't ordain people with epilepsy.
Is that what they said?
Yes. So I also remember going to all those rallies and coming from a not particularly posh background, finding myself amongst a whole class of people that I had never had anything to do with before. So it felt, and also one of the reasons why in 1998 I was still the first woman priest is that my predecessor, who had been the first woman priest in the deanery, was black, and nobody wanted the first woman priest to celebrate in their church to be the black woman priest. So they held fire for 4 years until they could have the white woman priest in the other churches in the deanery. So, it's great, it's brilliant, 25 years is fantastic, but we have a long way to go on a whole range of other issues. So I am celebratory, but I'm also really conscious that there's miles to go, miles and miles. So.